Rock God is Stone Cold. The Hellraiser is back.
Here we go. Evolution of the Shield.
John Cena versus the Showstopper.
Hulk Hogan and The Rock in the same ring.
You will never take my place at the head of the table.
Undertaker with a Hell's Gate submission. Oh my God! What?
My God, Michaels just kicked Cena's head off.
The Monday Night Wars have come to WrestleMania.
It'll be The Rock. It'll be Austin one-on-one.
Third and five to the Undertaker.
Do you believe in miracles?
The streak is over.
Hey, what's going on, guys? As we are back here on Rivalries on the WWE podcast on this Friday, June 18th, 2 days away from the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view, as I believe this is going to be the last significant stop on the road back to fans being back in the stands. And I'm not going to lie, guys. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Matt said it, so many people have echoed this. I respect the hell out of what WWE has done with the Thunderdome, but now that we full well know that fans are on the horizon, it's becoming increasingly tough to watch the Thunderdome because we know we're just, 5 or 6 weeks away from like the lifeblood of WWE coming back and just making everything feel real again. And, you know, I'm a big hockey fan, obviously up here in Canada, and I was watching the hockey game in Vegas last night, and that building was absolutely rocking. And I just cannot wait for WWE to get back in front of fans. And the other thing is like I said last week, but I really don't expect Hell in a Cell to be all that big of a show in terms of significance on the landscape. I think Lashley will retain the championship. If it is Reigns versus Rey Mysterio, I hope he just obliterates Rey Mysterio. Maybe Charlotte wins the Raw Women's Championship. I think that could be something. And I think Bianca Belair is going to retain the SmackDown Women's Championship. But we're not here to talk about Hell in a Cell. Matt's going to have a preview show for you this weekend for sure. But we are here to talk about rivalries. And this week we will be going back to the year 2002 to cover The Rock versus Brock Lesnar that culminated at SummerSlam 2002. And not only was this rivalry significant in changing the landscape of the WWE as we knew it back then, but the entire product was going through a massive overhaul and facelift in 2002. The first off, it went from WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, to WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. And obviously the switch from federation to entertainment was primarily because of the World Wildlife Foundation. But it wasn't just the name that changed. It was also kind of the product as a whole that really started to shift towards more of an entertainment-based product. And this is when we saw the Ruthless Aggression era really step in. And we saw that the Attitude Era really got left in the rearview mirror over the course of 2002. And this program, for all intents and purposes, kind of started right after WrestleMania 18. And not because these two crossed paths right away, because they wouldn't cross paths until the summer. But it's because all the wheels began to be getting put in motion in 2002 directly following WrestleMania 18. So just to give you kind of a backstory on what happened at WrestleMania 18, you know, The Rock defeats Hulk Hogan, arguably the biggest victory of his career. Triple H wins the Undisputed Championship away from Chris Jericho. And then, obviously, you have the most insignificant match in the history of Stone Cold Steve Austin's main event run, as he defeated Scott Hall in a non-title match and that nobody really ever talks about. So those were like the three main matches at WrestleMania. And the night directly following WrestleMania is when we got our first look ever at the Beast Incarnate, Brock Lesnar.
He truly loves the kids that he has trained, including this one right here. Try to get a minute. Gotta give him a baby. I'm done with that. Stop that. got a referee with him, and wait a minute. Oh, what the hell? That's the hottest free agent. Brock Lesnar. I know who it is, but what's he doing out here? Oh, he's destroying bodies. Look at this monster. My God, the size of this human being. Look at who's at ringside with Brock. Oh, my God. What the hell is that Berman doing here? Paul Heyman at ringside. He's been fired. He doesn't work for this company any longer. What is he doing out here? And you don't think. He's shouting instructions to Brock. Oh, my God. Did you see that? By trying to hurricane run in this hardcore matchup. Drink. That is the scary strength of a spike is being broken in half. And that hideous Heyman. What is he even doing here? Did he buy a ticket? What? Wait a second out. What does this mean? What is Brock Lesnar? Paul Heyman? What's next?
So that's the first look we ever got at Brock Lesnar, who was 25 years old at the time, if I'm not mistaken, 24 or 25. And he gets ushered into the product just as they're switching to the Ruthless Aggression era. And in a lot of ways, Brock Lesnar was the face, or at least the early on face of Ruthless Aggression. You know, obviously we kind of associate with John Cena for the star he became exiting out of that area. And, you know, that's the first line he ever said on WWE television when he confronted Kurt Angle on SmackDown. But when you just say the phrase Ruthless Aggression, I often think of Brock Lesnar because of how his timeline of coming into the company really almost matched up with the WWE. But obviously he didn't jump directly into the main event scene. Not far off, and he got there real quick, but he didn't go directly there. But even WWE's main event scene was really going through a transition in the spring and early summer of 2002. As you had Triple H win the championship against Chris Jericho at WrestleMania 18. The very next pay-per-view, Backlash, he drops it to Hulk Hogan. Which, I mean, I understood, okay, whatever, you want to give Hogan one last run with the championship. He's, 2-3 months into his return to the company. I found it a bit weird that they made Triple H drop it so fast after winning it. His first ever world championship victory as a babyface. But, okay, I can see it. The very next championship pay-per-view after that, you have Hulk Hogan drop it to The Undertaker. And it's The Undertaker's first WWE championship victory in, I want to say, 4 years, since he was a heel with the corporation and the corporate ministry, and he was feuding on and off with Stone Cold Steve Austin. So now you have it go to The Undertaker, and The Undertaker is a heel at this point as Big Evil, and that's his whole gimmick. But following WrestleMania 18, you had The Rock step away from the company to go film, I believe it was The Rundown with Sean William Scott. So he had been almost entirely gone for April and May, leading into June. And then in early June, Stone Cold Steve Austin walks out. And he had a few kind of throwaway matches at this point, like Stone Cold Steve Austin, like he had feuded. I think he had a match against The Big Show and Ric Flair at the Judgment Day pay-per-view. Just very insignificant storylines and programs for Stone Cold Steve Austin. And as we infamously know, that he walked away when he was supposed to lose a King of the Ring qualifying match to Brock Lesnar on Monday Night Raw. So you have this guy, Brock Lesnar, who's just blowing up the card in WWE, as he had a program with the Hardy Boys, as he beat Jeff at Backlash, he beat both of them at Judgment Day, and then he ends up winning the King of the Ring match, or the tournament rather, in the finals against Rob Van Dam. And he had an on and off program with Rob Van Dam. He actually had an Intercontinental Championship match against Van Dam prior to the King of the Ring pay-per-view. And then, or it was right after at Judgment Day. But he beat Van Dam in the finals of the King of the Ring pay-per-view to become the number one contender to the Undisputed Championship. But he wins this match for the right to challenge then Undisputed Champion Undertaker for the championship at SummerSlam. But the Monday Night Raw before the King of the Ring pay-per-view, there was a return to the company that would surely shake up the main event scene in WWE.
The he you kept talking about is not Stone Cold, then who the hell is the he you were talking about?
This is mine!
Oh my God! I don't believe it! It's the People's Champion! The Rock! The Rock has come home! What? Can you believe this ovation? Can you believe this reception? It's the Rock! The incomparable People's Champion! The Rock! The Star of Scorpion King is back! The Star of SmackDown! Yeah! Look at that! That's not the he you were thinking he was in a minute! But that is the he! This is an unbelievable ovation for the People's Champion! I don't believe this!
So, The Rock, who had been away for just about 2.5 months at this point, returns to the company on Monday Night Raw. And that's another tidbit about what was going on in the company at this time, because right before The Rock had left, directly following WrestleMania, they had the inaugural brand split, and The Rock was the first overall selection to SmackDown. So him coming back on Monday Night Raw, like, nobody saw it coming, and you saw Vince obviously playing the part, dumbfounded oh so well, and it was a return that needed to happen. Because just a few weeks prior, you had Stone Cold Steve Austin walk out, and we miss out on a match of Austin versus Brock, albeit on a Monday Night Raw with zero build, but that's a dream match that we never saw. And obviously, you still had Triple H at the top of the card, you still had The Undertaker as champion, but while Undertaker and Triple H are great in their own right, and, you know, I would say are all-time legends, they weren't the same type of caliber as guys like The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. Like, you could make the case right now that those two are the two biggest stars in the history of the company. So even if you would have built to Brock Lesnar versus Undertaker at SummerSlam, we all know now in hindsight that they had a historic rivalry that really only culminated in 2015. And obviously Brock ended the streak and all that. But at this time, they had no history. They had no pre-existing storyline. And again, The Undertaker was not even close to the phenomenon that he became in the later years. And as for Triple H, in my opinion, obviously it's subjective, he's the best heel ever. And he's right under Rock and Austin for me as the best of all time. But again, would Brock defeating Triple H have had the same type of impact as opposed to him going over on Stone Cold Steve Austin or against The Rock? And that's why The Rock's return to the company in mid-June of 2002 to really kind of line up with the ascent of Brock Lesnar was so imperative to what WWE was trying to do. Because you got to think back to where creatives' minds were at this time. You had Stone Cold Steve Austin who walked out, and they probably thought that he was not going to come back at all. And if he did come back, it would be for a short-lived run and for an undetermined amount of time. And who knows when he would even come back. And all in all, that's what happened. He ends up coming back 8 months later for a month and a half, and then he hangs up his boots at WrestleMania 19 in March of 2003. As for The Rock, and it's not hard to find this out if you listen to what Bruce Pritchard said on one of the Ruthless Aggression episodes on the WWE Network, is that they knew what was coming. You know, it was the second consecutive year that he had stepped away from the company for several months immediately following WrestleMania to kind of go off and advance his Hollywood career. And like I said before, I'm pretty sure this time around it's when he filmed The Rundown. The year before that, it was The Scorpion King. And then when he would leave in late 2002, I believe that was when Walking Tall came out. And, you know, you fast forward one full calendar year into, let's say, June of 2003, and The Rock's days as a full-time competitor in the WWE were completely long gone. So they knew that they had to fast track to a new face of the company. And you had pre-existing options like Triple H, who in a lot of ways became the face of Monday Night Raw and kind of like the workhorse of the company for 2003, 2004, 2005, right up until John Cena, Batista, and Randy Orton kind of came about. And he kind of really anchored Monday Night Raw along with the likes of Chris Jericho and a returning Shawn Michaels. You look over to SmackDown, you obviously have The Undertaker, who kind of ran parallel with Triple H, although he didn't hold the title as much. But Undertaker was kind of like the workhorse of SmackDown. Obviously, you had Kurt Angle, who was arguably the best in-ring competitor at the time. And then you kind of had like the Big Show as just like the big heel who could like work and do some good things and could always like be a legitimate character in a storyline. So you kind of had Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels playing the same part on opposite brands, and Triple H and Undertaker playing the same parts on opposite brands. But Brock Lesnar was kind of like their ace in the hole to have a bona fide up-and-coming main event star for the following generation. Or so they thought. We obviously know that Brock stepped away a year and a half later, and he was never really what they expected him to be. But you put yourself in the moment in the middle of 2002, and that's exactly what happened. But The Rock comes back, and he announces that he'll be at the King of the Ring, and he ultimately ends up going back to SmackDown, which was his home. He was the face of SmackDown. And he gets entrenched in a program with The Undertaker and Kurt Angle, which leads to a triple threat match at the Vengeance pay-per-view for the WWE Undisputed Championship. And it was on this night, the pay-per-view directly before SummerSlam in the middle of July 2002, that we fully got confirmation that The Rock and Brock Lesnar were going to be on a collision course at SummerSlam.
The Undertaker losing oxygen. He's got his hands in between the legs. Undertaker is trying to counter. There's a cover, a count, a near fall. But the longer the Undertaker fights it, the harder he fights it. Oh my God! The quicker he's going to go down. Oh my God! My God, that's inhuman. That is inhuman.
Where did he get there? Oh, he's got it again.
Right back to the triangle. The triangle choke.
Yeah, he's really got it cinched in. Look at this.
Yeah.
He's got a tap.
The Undertaker's undisputed title hanging in the balance here. It's damn near over.
He's got a tap.
This war is almost over.
Oh, wait a minute. He's out. He's out. One more time and he's out. Kurt Angle is out.
And The Rock.
What?
The Rock stopped it. The Undertaker's arm, you gotta believe, was gonna drop for the third and final time. But The Rock stopped it.
Watch it, Kurt.
Rock going for the Rock bottom. It's counted. Ankle lock. The ankle lock. The Rock tap.
Did you see the quickness, the cat-like quickness of Kurt Angle? Now he's got the Rock.
What a phenomenon the Kurt Angle is. He's got the ankle lock on The Rock. But The Rock counters. There's a counter. The count. No! No, my God, how close was that?
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Look out. Oh, no.
Undertaker hooking up Undertaker drilling a rock in the headlights. The angle slam on the Undertaker. The Undertaker is down.
How much more can these guys do?
The champion is down. Angle is up.
Look at Kurt Angle. He's
The way to rock bottom. Rock bottom. Rock bottom. Yes. It's over. It's over. The Rock. The Rock.
is the winner of this match and new WWE Undisputed Champion, The Rock.
My God, what a main event! And The Rock is not only the People's Champion, he's the Undisputed Champion. This was a war.
So The Rock wins the Undisputed Championship against Kurt Angle and The Undertaker at the main event of Vengeance 2002. And I think this was them saying, okay, we really have to get the belt on The Rock and build towards what in my mind is probably the most significant and important SummerSlam main event of all time. And if you guys have a better thought than that, if you guys think that there is a more important, more significant match than Rock versus Brock at SummerSlam 2002, I would sure as hell like to hear it, because you have to think of the significance that this match had. For one, it was the old Lion versus the new Lion. And it's kind of weird to say because they had just built that 6 months prior at WrestleMania between Rock and Hogan, and now Rock was playing Hogan's rule, a couple months later. But they knew that The Rock was leaving behind the scenes, and I think the fans knew too. The writing was on the wall. He was kind of going, at this point, he was on the schedule that John Cena was on in, let's say, 2016, 2017. He would come back for a couple of months for a full-time run, then he would go away for a couple of months. And he would come back for a couple of months full-time run, and then he would go away. That's kind of what he was doing. Exactly what Cena was doing in 2016 and 2017. So, and we remember, and obviously the internet is way more of a thing nowadays than it was, 19 years ago. But people started to know that The Rock's days in WWE were numbered. And you have to realize that now at this point, The Rock is on, 3 years as a main event level babyface. In a lot of ways, he was booked, bigger than Stone Cold Steve Austin, especially since they had turned Austin heel in 2001. And even though they turned him babyface in late 2001, The Rock still got that match against Hogan. The Rock was still the guy to get the big victory for Team WWF to culminate the invasion angle. And now, obviously, in Austin's absence, The Rock becomes the WWE champion as he wins that title for the 7th time. And then they have the month to build Rock versus Brock. And the way that they built this, was pretty cool, because there were some similarities between The Rock and Brock, besides the fact that their names rhyme. I'm having a blast, saying Rock, Brock, Brock, Rock. But, I think that the simple fact that they were kind of like athletes outside of wrestling had a big thing to do with it. Obviously, Brock was an amateur wrestler, and The Rock had played football. And obviously, post WWE, the first time around for Brock, he tried out football. But I think there were a lot of similarities between the two. And then obviously, you had Paul Heyman there just doing his masterful work even 19 years ago. And there was kind of that history between The Rock and Paul Heyman when Paul Heyman was the commentator for WWE alongside Jim Ross. And he was, the general manager of ECW in the invasion angle. But it was really when we saw their first encounter that we really got a sense of just how big this match was going to be.
Here tonight live. Latino Heat.
Wait a minute. Oh, no. The Singapore King match with Brock Lesnar and Tommy Dreamer is upon us, but
Look at this. He paid absolutely no attention to The Rock.
I think you're seeing an illustration, King, of some mind games by Brock Lesnar. Remember, Lesnar will meet The Rock at SummerSlam next month in the Nassau Coliseum, Uniondale, Long Island. And The Rock, I think, I can't read his mind, but I would think that the mind game didn't work quite as Lesnar and Heyman might have envisioned.
So Brock comes down the ramp after The Rock has a promo against Eddie Guerrero, and he just ignores The Rock. And, you know, they're really trying to play on the fact that The Rock and Brock Lesnar are supposed to be on even terms in the mind of Brock. And obviously The Rock, now a 7-time WWE champion, you know, kind of thinking like, who the hell is this rookie? You know, who does he think he is? I've been the face of this company for the last 3 or 4 years. I beat Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. And the mind games, as you see, of Brock Lesnar trying to be on par with The Rock and really trying to make it feel as though, like, man, does this guy have a shot to unseat The Rock at the biggest main event in the history of SummerSlam? And when we got the promo package to this match, I know I harp a lot on promo packages, but this is a very underrated one because it showed a side of The Rock that he had learned that, man, I got to take this guy Brock Lesnar seriously. He may be the biggest challenger I've ever had in this company. And when we finally got to see what The Rock did to prepare for this contest, obviously kayfabe, but the way WWE built it made you truly believe that Brock Lesnar had a shot in this match. And, you know, going in, obviously I'm a massive Rock fan. You think like, yeah, you know, The Rock's going to win. Like, there's no way that they're going to put the championship on a guy who has been here for pretty much a cup of coffee. And obviously they are billing him as the next big thing. And, you know, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to realize that, you know, maybe by WrestleMania season, he's going to win the Rumble and then go on to win the championship, which, you know, on a side note, he did end up doing that in addition to what happened at SummerSlam. But there was no way, in my opinion, that I thought that Brock Lesnar had even a snowball's chance in hell of winning the championship and, you know, unseating The Rock at the top of the food chain. But, I mean, when you start looking at it from maybe a real-life perspective and you saw where the company was heading with no Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock fast-tracking to Hollywood, maybe this was their opportunity to give themselves a new face. And, you know, if The Rock didn't step away or wasn't in the process of stepping away from wrestling, maybe this would have gone a bit differently. If The Rock had come back from his latest movie skit and said, or his latest filming of his movie, and said to Vince McMahon and creative, like, yeah, you know, I'm good for another 2 or 3 years full time, I don't know if they make Brock Lesnar the champion. Because, for one, you're not in such a rush to make a brand new star to, you know, main event at the top of your roster. B, the fans wouldn't have been turning on The Rock because this is when they started to really full well know and chant he was a sellout, and that was on full display when SummerSlam came around. So if The Rock was sticking around, you wouldn't have had the fans trying to turn on him. And even if you did want to turn him heel because the character had gotten stale, he had pretty much been playing the same part for 2 or 3 years by this juncture, you know, that's fine. But I don't think the fans there wouldn't have been such an urgency to, you know, take the belt off of him and avoid fan backlash. And you could have maybe booked it more long term. You know, Brock Lesnar goes on to win the 2003 Royal Rumble and main event WrestleMania 19 against Kurt Angle. If The Rock is a main event competitor, maybe he sticks as champion all the way to WrestleMania and they have their part 2 match where Brock Lesnar conquers him. You know, it's a fair ask because, look, The Rock was a SmackDown guy. He was exclusive to the SmackDown brand. Obviously, at this juncture, the World Heavyweight Championship didn't exist, so the World Champion would float between brands. But he was the SmackDown guy, and not even a month later, they brought out the World Championship, and each champion became exclusive to their respective brands. So I think that there wouldn't have been an urgency to put Brock as over as he did, especially against the biggest star in the company at this point, because without Stone Cold Steve Austin there, The Rock was the champion. And when we got to the go-home episode of SmackDown, they had a promo between one another that really gave you an idea what you were in for their main event clash at SummerSlam.
And while you boo Brock Lesnar because of your jealousy, and while you jeer Brock Lesnar because no one can do a damn thing about it, the fact is, just like Hulk Hogan's career is now over, the very same thing will happen to The Rock this Sunday at SummerSlam. But ladies and gentlemen, my client has a gift for you this evening, because my client wants The Rock to have just a little taste of SummerSlam. So before tonight is over, we personally guarantee you that Brock Lesnar and the People's Champ, The Rock, will collide tonight. Oh, wow.
So Paul Heyman, even 19 years ago, is just doing his damnedest to build towards Brock Lesnar's match. And it's just so crazy that 19 years later, we're still hearing my client, Brock Lesnar. And he really was the straw, and continues to be the straw that stirs the drink for the Brock Lesnar character. And it's going to be interesting to see that if and when Brock comes back, if they put Heyman back with them, obviously with what's going on with Roman Reigns over on SmackDown. But staying on track here, they're trying to drive home the fact that The Rock has no chance and he doesn't know it. And he's going to lose the championship to this guy that is 25 years old and has never held the championship, let alone a world title in his career. And a side note, Brock Lesnar has never won a championship in WWE other than a world championship. It's either been the WWE championship or the Universal championship. So that kind of goes to show you how they kind of viewed Brock Lesnar. No IC title, no US title, no tag championships. It's either world championship or bust for Brock. But with all the smack that Heyman's talking and all of this, the flexing and the intimidation that Brock Lesnar is trying to portray, The Rock inserts himself in the equation to put his 2 cents in on the matter.
So far, your big, jacked up monkey has bought nothing! But you see, tonight will be a night like no other. No. The Rock says you didn't hear. Tonight will be a night like no other. Tonight, no just bring it. No sticking up your candy asses. No smell what The Rock is cooking. And quite frankly, Brock Lesnar, seeing as you flat out refuse to bring it to The Rock, well, The Rock will just have to bring it to you. Here we go. say that before the night is through, The Rock and Brock will collide. Well, then The Rock says, as far as he's concerned, this night is already through.
Here we go! Let's go! Wait a minute! Look at ambushing The Rock!
So The Rock comes out and he obviously gets ambushed by Guerrero and Chris Benoit. And, you know, Matt and I talked about it in our What If show. Like, what if The Rock had stuck around full-time during the Ruthless Aggression era, and seeing him, you know, mix it up with guys like Guerrero and Benoit. It's pretty crazy to see what we missed out on. And, you know, he had a match with Chris Benoit at Fully Loaded in 2000 for the championship, and he had a match with Eddie Guerrero on Monday Night Raw around this time, actually, about a couple weeks prior, for the championship, or not for the championship, just the main event. But just side notes, too bad all the matches we missed out on with The Rock. But they were really making a big deal about this match, and as they should, because... And I'm really curious to hear your guys' opinion on this. You can email Matt at realwwepodcast@gmail.com, or you can get me on Twitter, ADamarco25, about whether or not you agree that this was the biggest and most significant main event in the history of SummerSlam. I truly want to know if you guys agree with this. Because, you know, looking back on it, the landscape that shifted because of this main event, in my opinion, is unmatched and like nothing we've ever seen, that we had ever seen leading up to it and that we have seen since. And, you know, here you heard the crowd was completely behind The Rock. But when it was time to get to Nassau Coliseum, the home of the New York Islanders, I may add, just a crazy building for playoff hockey, you really saw a switch, and there was a vibe that the crowd was in with the new. And as this match kind of dragged on, you started to get the sense that the crowd was leaning more on the side with Brock Lesnar. And as the match kind of came to a close, the fans got what they wanted.
Two proud men, two national champions, The Rock in college football, Brock Lesnar in college wrestling. And tonight going for the most prestigious prize in sports entertainment today, the undisputed title. Brock Lesnar, I'm very surprised that's in front of the next five right there. Spinebuster! Spinebuster! And here it comes! But which time, Rock? Nail his people's elbow, man! The most electrifying move in sports entertainment today or any day! You've seen it so many times. Lesnar's off! What a clothesline! What a hit! What a hit! Brock like a linebacker, almost taking The Rock out of his boots. Here it is! Oh no! It's a 5-count pull! And The Rock countered! The Rock countered! And the promo pole! The right hand battling back! Lesnar blocked the rock bottom! Now look out! In front of the rock bottom! Look under! Brock Lesnar! He countered! Oh man! And look out! F5! And F5 to The Rock! The cover! One! Up to the two! Three! Lesnar has defeated The Rock! Brock Lesnar is champion!
Undisputed champion, the next big thing, Brock Lesnar.
An F5 from Brock Lesnar has taken out The Rock. Brock Lesnar has become the youngest champion in WWE history.
And there you have it. Brock gets the clean victory over The Rock. And that's a big thing because Bruce Pritchard said this once on his show, Something to Wrestle With, that Vince and creative actually wanted to make Brock win by hook or crook. And it was The Rock who said, no, you got to get this guy over clean. You got to make him, you know, no pun intended, but you got to make him the next big thing. You have to make him a legitimate force, a legitimate main eventer, and put him over clean on me. And apparently that's why these two are still friends to this day. Like there's that clip of, I believe it was Brock backstage at UFC and The Rock was in attendance and he went back there to see him. But if I'm not mistaken, they still have a long-lasting relationship because Brock appreciates that The Rock, you know, kind of vouched for him and said, no, put him over clean. This is what has to be done. And again, not to use a cliche, but it was best for business. And you heard that The Rock was getting booed when he was setting up for the People's Elbow, and you heard the crowd explode when Brock got up and clotheslined him, and then eventually hit that F5 in the 1-2-3 that solidified his first ever WWE championship, and he went on to win another 3 or 4 over the next year and a half. You know, he exchanged it a few times with the Big Show and Kurt Angle. Ultimately lost it to Guerrero No Way Out 2004, but before he walked away from the company for 8 years. And we know what he's done since 2012 upon his return. But another thing is that he became the youngest world champion ever. And, you know, he was unseated later by Randy Orton just 2 years later at that very same pay-per-view SummerSlam after he had left the company. But there was just so many significant aspects about this victory. You know, the first thing is it's a change of the guard. That's the first thing, that you're going away from one of the faces of the Attitude Era and you're really embracing the Ruthless Aggression Era. Number 2, it's the first guy to win the World Championship without winning the secondary championship since, I want to say, was it Lex Luger or maybe Hulk Hogan? You know, because every world champion before, or no, I think it was The Undertaker actually, because The Undertaker as well has never won a U.S. or Intercontinental Championship. So he's the first guy since The Undertaker back in 97 to win a world championship without having to go through the IC title or the European Championship or something like that. Second of all, he becomes exclusive to the SmackDown brand shortly thereafter. So, you know, The Rock was a floating champion just like Taker was and Triple H was. But as soon as Brock wins it, I think not even a month later, he becomes exclusive to the SmackDown brand. So he becomes the inaugural face of SmackDown in terms of a champion. That's another aspect. Number 2, or I don't even know what number I'm on now. My math is so bad, guys. But I think the biggest aspect beyond that is that it's the last time we would ever see The Rock as a full-time babyface. And that's pretty damn significant. You know, looking back 19 years later, this was the lasting image of The Rock as a babyface full-time competitor in the company. As he walks away, getting booed out of Nassau Coliseum, and I forget what exactly he did, but he did something sarcastic to the crowd. I don't know if he gave them the finger or something along those lines, but before he walks through Gorilla, he, for all intents and purposes, turns heel. And the next time we would see him, which was in late January 2003, to come back to build towards him versus Hogan 2 at No Way Out, he is full-blown heel, and he's the Hollywood heel, and he embraces the full heel gimmick for his final full-time run with the company that would culminate at Backlash 2003 against Bill Goldberg. But even though that was his last full-time run, he was a heel at the time. So this run that ended in 2002 at SummerSlam against Brock becoming champion was the last time we would see The Rock as a full-time babyface. And obviously he comes back in 2011, wins the championship in 2013. And he wasn't a full-time competitor then. He was obviously still a babyface, but he wasn't a full-time competitor. He wasn't fighting on Raw. He wasn't fighting on SmackDown. He was just kind of on the Brock Lesnar nowadays type of schedule when he's champion. So a lot of significant things to dissect from this rivalry, from this match, from this program, from this time in the company as a whole. It was just a massive time of transition for the WWE, and it really got started off on what I would say was a pretty damn good foot, which giving the championship to Brock Lesnar, because fast forward 19 years later, he's still one of the biggest attractions in the industry, and this is in large part to how his career started, dethroning one of, if not the best WWE champion of all time in The Rock. And it's so significant all these years later because now The Rock is one of the most famous guys in Hollywood or in the world. So you look back, and even people who aren't wrestling fans, they could be like, oh my God, who's this guy that Dwayne Johnson lost to when he was still a wrestler? Oh, who's this massive guy, Brock Lesnar? Oh, he's still around in WWE? Oh, let's go check out Monday Night Raw. You know, these are very real things that happen, and how, you know, you think of it from a business perspective. And I think that's a lasting image, or a lasting reason rather, as to why Brock is still a megastar to this day, even to people who aren't avid wrestling fans. He is probably still the only lasting character now that John Cena stepped away, and whether or not he comes back, he could also, fit this bill. But Lesnar is one of the few guys still affiliated with the product that is larger than life, and goes beyond wrestling. As much as we want to say Roman Reigns is a megastar, no one outside of a pure wrestling fan knows who the hell he is. If you don't watch SmackDown every week, you don't know who Roman Reigns is. But you know who Brock Lesnar is. You know who John Cena is. And obviously Brock went on to be a UFC star. He had a cup of coffee in the NFL with the Minnesota Vikings. But it still has a lot to do with the fact that he defeated one of the biggest stars in the wrestling industry at the time, and who has become one of the biggest stars in the world, as we now know him as Dwayne Johnson. But once upon a time, he was The Rock, and I still like to pretend he still is The Rock because he's my favorite wrestler of all time. But look, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode of Rivalries. It's one of the bigger episodes and longer episodes I've ever done, but I hope you agreed to it, or you enjoyed it rather, because I think it was one worthy of such. And a bit more audio this week, but again, I think I would have been doing you guys a disservice not to give you a real feeling to where the entire company and landscape of the roster was at this point. So as always, you can find me on Twitter at ADeMarco25. You can get Matt on Twitter at wrestling_audio. You can email him at realwwepodcast@gmail.com. And seriously, guys, I want you to answer this question. And you can maybe email him or leave a voicemail for his mailbag edition, and I'm sure he would be more than happy to answer it and even give his 2 cents on it as well, as to whether or not you believe this was the biggest main event in the history of SummerSlam and the most significant match of that specific pay-per-view. But as always, guys, I will be back on Saturday with the What If segment exclusive to Patreon with Matt. And until next week, unless I catch you on the Patreon feed, I will talk to you next time.